name is Debbie Zwicky, and I am the chapter social worker for the Wisconsin chapter of HDSA. And I will tell you right now, I do not have any slides because I'm a tech dinosaur. But they taught me how I'm supposed to go through just these. Bada bing, bada boom, that's it. There. That is the extent of my PowerPoint. Okay. So I guess I'd like to start today by telling you all a little bit about how I became involved in the HD community. 5.5 years ago, I retired from my full-time job, which was working as an outpatient behavioral health therapist. And going back 20 years ago, I was working at our local hospital's behavioral health unit, and I received a referral from one of our family practitioners. And he said, "Deb, I'd like you to see one of our patients." He said, "She's really struggling." And she said, "Her husband has Huntington's disease." Well, I really had never heard of it. And I kept thinking to myself, what could be so bad, you know? So I started to work with her for individual counseling. And during the course of my treatment, her husband actually asked to join. So we did some couple work and saw them maybe on and off for about a year. And at the end of a year, the woman said to me one day, she said that she had become aware that there were several other HD families in our local area, which is Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And she said she had been trying very hard to maybe pull together a support group for HD patients and families. But she said, "I have so much on my plate." She said, "I'm not only caretaking my husband, but one of our teenage daughters has recently been diagnosed with juvenile onset Huntington's." So she said, "Would you ever be interested in maybe starting up a support group?" And I've always been the kind of person to say, I'll give it a try. I'll try anything once. So that September, 19 years ago, I started our Oshkosh support group on a Saturday morning at a board meeting room in our local hospital. And we just kept going. We just kept meeting. And the years kept passing. And we just kept meeting. And then it got to be about almost 5.5 years ago, right before my retirement. And I was retiring after working 41 years in mental health. So I was ready to retire. And one of my coworkers came up to me in the hall one day and he said, "You're not going to keep doing that Huntington's thing, are you, after you retire?" And I didn't even have to hesitate because I said, "Well, of course I'm going to keep doing it." And I think it took me aback, but it also shocked him because I will tell you at that point in my career, I was really burned out. I was really, really burned out. In fact, during that Christmas, I had one of my family members that I hadn't seen for quite a while say to me, "Debbie, are you going to miss it?" And all I could think of saying to her was, "I hate people." I mean, I do. I just hate humanity. I don't ever want to talk to anybody ever again. But then, after Christmas and 3 days before I retired, I received a letter in the mail from a previous HDSA social worker in Wisconsin letting me know that the chapter social worker position was open and asked me if I'd be interested. And I will be very honest with you, my very first thought was, I am never going to work for anybody ever again. I am never, ever going to do that. But then I thought back to my response to my coworker, and as I thought more and more about it, I realized that working with the HD community had really been the most rewarding part of my entire social work career. So I said yes, and here I am 5.5 years later doing this. So before I get into talking about the challenges of caretaking through the different stages, I'd like to just say a few words about relationships and expectations. I have always believed that from the time we come into this world, we enter into relationships. Obviously, the first relationship is our mother, and then our father, siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, and then as we grow older, we make friends. We meet teachers, we have relationships with coaches, with bosses, professors, neighbors, and then we eventually meet perhaps a significant other. And I have always believed that with every single relationship we have in our lives, there comes with that a certain set of hopes and dreams and expectations. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. About 3 years ago, I received a call from a gentleman in Wisconsin, and he started by saying that he was a farmer and that he owned 500 acres of cornfields. And he said, the farm has been in my family for years, and my son runs it with me. Now, I was not there 30 years before when that son was born, but I can only imagine that that dad may have looked at that little baby boy and thought to himself, someday this could be yours. Someday I could pass this on to you. And then I met a young lady a few years ago who was going to be married. And she said, Debbie, I'm so excited because all my life I have dreamt about my dad walking me down the aisle. A few months later, I met an older couple, retired, and they told me that shortly after the time of their marriage, they started a special savings account 40 years before, so that when they retired, they could build a beautiful log cabin up north, is what we say in Wisconsin, up north in Wisconsin, and the land that they had purchased was on kind of a bluff that overlooked just a beautiful lake in northern Wisconsin. But there would be about 30 to 40 steps from house down to the water line. And then, about a year ago, I met a 14-year-old young girl. And she said to me one day, she said, you know, Deb, my mom left when I was a baby. I don't even know who she is or where she is. But I always thought my dad would be there to protect me and take care of me. But I've always believed that when the diagnosis of Huntington's enters the picture, life just gets interrupted. Oftentimes in my work as a therapist, I would use the analogy of life kind of being like a minefield. We all get up, we're walking through our day, we're doing good, but all of a sudden we step on a live one. And when that bomb goes off, I always say it takes a long, long time for all those ashes to settle. Now, about 20-some years ago, I attended Al-Anon meetings for about 3 years as one of my family members was struggling with alcoholism. And they had a phrase that I just really clung to. At first I didn't get it, but it goes like this: expectations are nothing more than premeditated disappointments. And at first I thought, well, that's kind of crummy, we shouldn't have hopes. But I think what that meant is that of course, we need to have our goals and dreams and hopes, but I think it also has to be tempered with the reality that sometimes we step on a live one and that bomb goes off. So as I circle back to the relationships described above, I spoke to the farmer a few months ago and he said, Debbie, he said, my son's career is so horrible, I can't even let him in the barn, I can't let him near machinery. I talked with a young woman about 2 weeks before she got married, and she said, okay, I can understand he can't walk me down the aisle, but now he's not even going to come. He wants to stay home for my wedding day. And then the couple who wanted to build their log cabin, they shared with me that they decided instead to buy a one-story condo near a major medical center. Now, the 14-year-old girl, I will tell you a little bit about that. A few years back, I received a phone call from a school district in northern Wisconsin, and they had some concerns about one of their students. And they said this girl was truant all the time, or she would get to school and she would fall asleep. And they were aware that her mother had never been in the picture, and she had been raised by her father alone. And they found out that he had Huntington's. So they invited me up to do an in-service for staff so that they could better understand this girl. But to make a long story short, what came of that is eventually the girl was able to open up to her social worker, her school counselor, and she was able to tell them that her father had what I refer to as the HD rages, just the uncontrollable, angry outbursts, yelling, accusations, and that oftentimes she'd be sound asleep at night and their bedroom door would fly open and he'd be standing there just yelling. She also then shared that apparently he had made multiple suicide attempts and many were in front of her. So she said, I'm afraid to go to school for fear of what I'm going to come back to at the end of my day. I always believe, too, that when these bombs go off in our lives and HD enters the picture, the process of grieving starts. And I think most people know all the stages of grieving, but I want to tell just a couple of little stories. Last fall, I met with a gentleman whose wife had just been diagnosed with HD, and we met in a diner in his local little farm town. And he was going on, and he said, some days, Deb, I just am angry. I'm so angry at the world. And then other days, he said, I can't keep it together. I cry all the time. And then another time, he said, some mornings I wake up and I still don't believe it's happening. Like, I just can't wrap my head around it. Well, I made the mistake of saying, Frank, I think you're grieving. Well, he took his fist on that diner table and he pounded it and he said, my God, Debbie, she's not even dead. And I said, grieving is not reserved for just death and dying. Not at all. We grieve losses all the time. So when I talk about the stages of grieving, obviously the first would be the shock and the denial. I have one couple in Wisconsin, and both of them are retired music professors. And the gentleman reached out to me shortly after her diagnosis. She was diagnosed right after her retirement. And he keeps saying, and he still says to this day, I can't believe she has Huntington's. Right before she retired, she played an entire clarinet concerto. She even once appeared at Carnegie Hall. How can this be? And now she can't even hold an instrument. She chooses not to. Another story of shock took place about 15 years ago when I was doing the support group. 3 adult children from a family joined our support group. And it was in winter, right after Christmas. And they said that their dad, their biological father, had left them shortly after the youngest was born. So they grew up with mom. And one Christmas day, that previous Christmas, they were all at their mom's house, and they had their spouses and their children, and it was a joyous Christmas occasion. But there was a knock on the door. And when they went to answer it, stood a man that they did not recognize, and he said, I am here to tell you that I am your biological father and that I have Huntington's. Yeah, Merry Christmas. People also in grieving, they go through stages like bargaining. Like, God, if you just make this go away, I'll go to church every Sunday, or I'll stop drinking. And then people go through the stages of anger. And this is when I hear people, call me and say, how can this happen? She's healthy as a horse. Why us? She's the salt of the earth. I mean, she's the rock of the family. How can this happen? And they get angry at God and angry at everything. And then depression, those horrible, horrible waves of just despair. And I think they're there because we're mourning the loss again of what we thought our relationships with our loved ones was going to be. And the final one comes as acceptance. And I have a lot of people struggle with acceptance. And in fact, my university music professor said, I think instead of saying, I accept it, I think we just have to adjust to a new normal. And for them, he said, it's baffling, but all my gifted wife wants to do is sit in her easy chair all day, morning to night, watching tennis with the sound off. Now, she never played tennis. She never owned a tennis racket, never showed any interest in tennis until she was diagnosed with Huntington's. And he said, you know what? She's happy. It keeps her calm. This is our new normal. So anyway, I'm going to start talking about navigating the changes for caregivers especially as we go through the different stages of HD. And I'm going to keep it kind of simple. I'm going to stick with early stage, middle, and late. So obviously in the early stage of Huntington's, you start to see those little movements. There might be fingers drumming. There might be throat clearing. You might have some difficulty concentrating or thinking, or your problem-solving ability isn't really what it used to be. But for the most part, people in this stage are fairly independent, and many of them are still working. And to me, I think the most significant part of this stage is that I find that the caregiver and the loved one are kind of on the same page. They're just going at it together. So in the early stage of Huntington's, I always tell families that the most important tasks for caregivers especially would be education and preparation. I tell people, learn everything you can about HD, because knowledge is power, and an informed caregiver is a prepared caregiver. Now, when I get new referrals or families reach out to me and say, yeah, Dr. Shannon said I should call you, I usually, if they're willing, I like to set up a meeting with the family. And I've met people at diners, public parks, coffee shops, and even once in a cornfield during COVID. And I always feel like Mary Poppins. I'm bringing my bag and I have my packet. I have all the HDSA pamphlets, and I've got our Wisconsin resource manual, our list of Wisconsin support groups. And I try to give them as much information as possible. I also encourage people to attend support groups because it is amazing how much you learn from each other. I run a statewide support group, a Zoom group in Wisconsin, and in April, everybody's heads popped up, little squares with heads, but there was one box on the lower right-hand side, and it was just a phone number, and he was muted. So I welcomed the black box, and I said, just absorb if you want, or if you want to participate, feel free. But he never said a word. No one said a word. But hour and a half later, as I'm starting to close the session, we heard crackling from the box. It was kind of like the last scene in Apollo 13. Houston, we're here. Only it was this gentleman, and he said, my doctor has been telling me to join a support group for years. And he said, I can't believe how much I've learned in just an hour and a half. So don't be afraid to join a support group. I tell people to read everything and anything you can on HD. Because I'm old school, I actually have handouts here, and I made a list of books that many of my support group people have read, that I have read, and have been recommended to me. And they are books not only on caregiving or the disease, but also books for teenagers and for children. There are cookbooks for how to make a soft diet. So afterwards, if you would like to, just come on up and grab an old-fashioned handout. And if you're into fiction, and maybe many of you know this, but about 9 years ago, I think it was, an author by the name of Lisa Genova wrote an excellent book called Inside the O'Briens. And it's a fictional account of a family affected by HD from diagnosis on. And, I always tell people it's not a real upper, but she does such a good job of just describing all the different dynamics that go into a Huntington's family. I also strongly recommend a couple of websites, and I put them on my book list as well. One is called hopes.stanford.edu. And Stanford did a Huntington's outreach project for education. And I love reading their articles. They're not technical, they're easy to read and easy to understand, which, is a challenge with Huntington's. Also, the Huntington Society of Canada also puts out really, really good articles. So be educated. The next thing I tell people in this stage is establish good medical care. Now, I know our country's big, and maybe you don't live near a center of excellence, but if you can, try to hook up with a center of excellence, or at least a movement disorder specialist. I tend to be very outspoken about this because through all of these years, 20 years now, of hearing stories from people and families about going to just their local neurologist or a family practitioner, and I have nothing against any of them, but many of them have told me the doctor actually has to go out of the office and Google it, having never seen it. 2 years ago, I had one lady go to her doctor because HD was rampant in her family, and she was starting to have some movements. So she went in to see her local neurologist, and he said, "Arlene, what are you worried about? Huntington's only affects men." Yep, and then just a couple months ago, I had a new family join our Oshkosh support group, and he had just recently been diagnosed, and they went to see their, I think it was a Green Bay neurologist, and he came in and he was just as happy as could be, and he said, "I got good news. The FDA just approved a new medication for Huntington's, and it will all but cure your symptoms." And I'm like, really? How did I miss that? Well, they gave me the name, and I looked it up, and here it was, a medicine that had been in trial, but the trial had been discontinued because the results were negative. So again, if you can get to a center of excellence or a movement disorder specialist, do so. I also have, HDSA puts out a physician's manual or physician's guide to the care of a Huntington's patient. And that's a wonderful, wonderful resource that many patients will order for their physicians, or I've sent many out to different physicians. The other part of this stage is the preparation. And this is kind of where I say to people, this is where you get all your ducks in a row. Maybe make a contact with your local aging and disability resource center. Talk to them about completing an advance directive, the power of attorney, maybe talk about guardianship if that would have to come up. Do a living will. Maybe contact your financial planner and see about doing a special needs trust. And maybe talk to an attorney. Update your will. So again, it's just education and preparation. So then we get into the middle stage of Huntington's, and this is where I always tell people things tend to get a little dicey. Obviously, movements increase. There's more clumsiness. You might start seeing your loved one fall. They may need more help with your basic activities of daily living, showering, dressing, toileting, feeding. They may start having difficulty swallowing. Their speech might be affected. But the most important thing I see happen in this stage for caregivers is that sometimes the roles shift. And I have had so many people through the years say to me, "I feel like I'm his mother. I have to tell him to get out of bed. I have to tell him to do his exercises." Or I have a young lady who says, "I'm the daughter, she's the mother, but I feel like I'm the mother." So roles sometimes shift during this period. Also, during this period, you might find some impulsivity or especially excessive spending. I had one man call me one time and he said, "Deb, is this normal? My wife, it's just the two of us, but she insists on ordering 37 new full-size bath towels. And I can't talk her out of it. And I even once said to her, why don't we do 36? She said, no, we need 37 bath towels. And that perseveration, that obsessive nature of HD can come out. Also, you will sometimes find just some poor judgment. Now, a couple winters ago, I had a call from a man up north in Wisconsin, and he said he woke up in the middle of the night and his wife wasn't in bed next to him. So he got up looking for her, and the kids were asleep, and he's looking and he's looking and he can't find her, but he hears something in the garage. So he opens the garage door, and there is his wife sitting in the car in the garage with the door down. The car is running, and she's in the car reading her book with the lights on inside. Well, he said it was just fumes, and he got her out of the car and pulled her in the house and said, what the hell were you thinking? And she said, I just didn't want to wake anybody up. I couldn't sleep and I wanted to read. So sometimes the thinking gets affected, and it can be serious. You might also find there is a lack of awareness of the severity of symptoms. I had one lady come to our support group a few months back saying, it has been a great month. I've only had 5 fender benders. and I will just do a sidestep here with the issue of driving, because the issue of driving tends to be a real hot issue. Nobody likes to give up their independence. But I tell people, if you are concerned about your partner's driving, call the doctor, let him or her know, and then let them be the bad guy. So that you don't have to be the one to say, you're not driving anymore. I had one gentleman in our support group say his doctor said to him when he was asking about his wife, if you even have to ask, it's time to stop. And then in this stage sometimes, as I said before, you might see the Huntington rages, the anger outbursts, the violence, sometimes paranoia, accusations. And so many people call me and say, what do I do? Well, he's never been like this before. He's never been violent. And obviously I say the first thing is you need to protect yourself. And if at all possible, remove yourself from that argument. And sometimes I tell people even to just go like this. Say, we're going to take a time out. And I'm going to go out in my shed, and you go down, work in the garden. But let's come back to it in 30 minutes, and we'll see what we can talk about. Most times, people have de-escalated. Another technique I came up with years ago working as a therapist is what I call low and slow. I was working with a very, very agitated man who had not been taking his medication, and he was yelling and screaming, and I got hit over the head with a 2-liter bottle of soda and pillows thrown at me. And all I did was, and I don't know how I did this, but I just lowered my voice and I spoke very slowly. And somehow that just helped to de-escalate his tantrum. So you can try that. But now obviously, if it gets to a point where things are bad, you may just have to call 911. But you also have to let the doctor know what's going on, because there are medications that can help this particular symptom. And most importantly, I say, you have to remember, this is not your loved one. This is HD. It's the disease. Also during this stage, I say to caregivers, prepare for dealing with the system. In most cases, this is where people start applying for Social Security disability or SSI or medical assistance, Medicaid. And as it is with most governmental programs, it can be frustrating, very, very maddening and frustrating. And so I tell people, make an appointment at your Social Security office. They will help you navigate some of the complexities of these forms. or the ADRC. Sometimes they will sit down with you and help you with that. Now, I'm just going to tell a brief story to give you an example of how frustrating this can be. When I became eligible for Social Security, everybody said, Deb, just pull it up on the computer. You can do it. I did. I got it up. I filled in the blanks. I answered all the questions. Then it came time to form an account. So it asked for a username. Well, I put my usual, which I usually use. Then it said, create a password. So I put in a few that I used, and each time it came up saying, password taken, try again. 45 minutes later, and probably 100 different passwords, my German temper took over, and excuse my French, I'm sorry I'm being recorded, but I pressed capital letters, F-U-C-K, Social Security, and it came up, password taken, try again. So I know I'm not the only one. Just take a chill pill before you try to do any of that. I think another major thing that people go through during this stage is they ride the emotional roller coaster. And I think one of the things that's the most hardest for caregivers is just the sense of unpredictability. As we know, HD is different for everyone. There is no one size fits all. Even within the same family, there can be a different age of onset, different rates of progression, and different symptoms. It's not like other diseases where there is a typical standard course of progression or prognosis. Now, when I was in my early 30s, I lost both my mom and dad to cancer. Now, my mom had been diagnosed 7 years before, and I remember going to one of her appointments, and I asked the doctor, where are we at here? And he said, with the treatments we have today, maybe 5 to 7 years. Okay. Well, literally 10 days after my mom was buried, my dad, who had never had a sick day in his life, was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of lung cancer. And I went to his doctor with him, and he said, Richard, without treatment, 4 to 6 weeks. With treatment, maybe a year. Now, neither one of those outlooks made me happy, but at least it was something I could wrap my mind around. It was something that gave me some sense of predictability and what to expect. With Huntington's, you don't have that. And now I'm going to tell my very favorite story from my college years, and surprisingly, it doesn't involve drinking. But when I was in graduate school, I had to take experimental psych, and we each had to own our own rat. And we'd have to go to the lab and do these experiments. And I always remember there was one. It was a big oblong wooden box divided into 3 sections. They were all mazes, and at the end of each maze was a food dispenser. So you'd put your rat in this one, and it would weeble its way down, and it would grab a pellet, and it would be a happy, happy rat. They keep grabbing more pellets, and they got more pellets, and they were happy. But the rats, when you put them in this one down here, every time they'd get down and reach for that food dispenser, they'd get a shock. It was awful. And it didn't take them long to realize we're not going there. We don't need that pellet that much. But the rats in the middle maze were the ones in which it was intermittent. Sometimes they'd get down there and they'd get a pellet, maybe they'd get a second one, then they'd get a zap. Then they'd go again, they'd get one, then they'd get a zap. And there was no rhyme or reason. Well, those rats actually started gnawing on their little rat fingers and their limbs. They started rolling around. They became really aggressive when put in cages with other rats. And I've always believed that's because those rats never knew what to expect. And when you're in a position like that where you don't know what's going to happen, what symptom is going to happen next, you feel crazy. You're the rat in the middle maze. I think another common thing I see in caretaking is what I call the lethal triad of emotions. Through the years, even working as a therapist, I would work with people caregiving, and they would tell me things like, I walk in and I see them, I just feel so sorry for them. I'm consumed with pity. But invariably, that person might just say or do something that might just make them angry, And it may be part of their disease, but they would get angry. And they wouldn't vent it, but immediately they would fly into guilt. So it'd be like this merry-go-round of pity, anger, and guilt, pity, anger, and guilt. But after hearing this through so many years, I came up with the idea that I really like guilt, not because it's an emotion that feels good, but because when I'm working with somebody who says they feel guilty about something, I know I've got somebody who has a value system, who has a moral compass. Because in order to feel guilty, you have to feel like you have transgressed one of your basic values. So I like guilt. And I always tell people too, and believe me, in my career I've had plenty of experience, I worry more about the people who never feel any guilt or remorse. And those are the sociopaths we have in our society. So guilt is cool. Also for caregivers during this stage, it's increased responsibility for almost everything. And as one of my group members mentioned, she said, I feel like I wear so many different hats. One minute I'm out mowing the lawn, then I'm blowing snow, then I'm cooking, then I'm the financial planner, then I'm making medical appointments, and then I'm a teacher because I have to teach our neighbors and our friends and family what this is all about. Or I feel like I'm a cruise activity director. We get up, what do you want to do today? Should we go for a ride? Should we do puzzles? So there's a lot of responsibility on caregivers. And because of that, I always say you need to accept, first of all, you need to ask for, but accept the help. You cannot do this alone, and I think this is the theme you're going to hear throughout this whole weekend. And if it means contacting a home health agency or a respite service or even volunteers, I know the ADRC in our town has a list of volunteers who will help with errands or just sitting for a couple hours so they can get out. Churches are great for volunteers too. So if a friend of yours says, let me bring dinner over, let them do it. If your neighbor says, let me mow your lawn this summer, just accept it, because I have always believed that at a better time in your life in the future, you can help someone else and you can pass that on. So accept the help. And also utilize that multidisciplinary team. Speech therapists are awesome. They can do swallow studies. They can teach you techniques to keep you from choking. Physical therapy is outstanding. It can help with strength and flexibility, coordination. They can even teach you how to fall safely. And in fact, I recently learned that most fire departments have what they call a fall prevention program, where they will probably send 2 cute little firemen into your home, and they will kind of do an assessment, and they'll say, maybe you need to move that cord, or pick up that rug, or rearrange the furniture. Occupational therapy. They're the king of assistive devices. You name it, they've got it. Raised toilet seats, weighted utensils, they're phenomenal. They can also help you get help installing a ramp or putting in shower grab bars, but they are good. And the dietary department. They can help you come up with recipes for soft food, or help you with thickeners so that you can swallow more easily, or help you with high caloric foods and drinks. But I think the most important thing during this stage is taking care of yourself, because caregiving is exhausting, physically and emotionally. I had one lady snap at me when I suggested that, and she said, "I don't have time for me. There's just no time for me." But I'm telling you, if you don't take care of yourself, you are not going to be any good to anybody you're caring for. You cannot provide the love, the care, and the support that your loved one needs if your fuel tank is empty. And by taking care of yourself, I don't mean book a month at a spa. I'm just saying eat 3 meals a day. Make sure you stay hydrated. Try to sleep when you can sleep. Sometimes it's kind of like the new baby thing. You know, put the baby down, sleep. Just rest because you need it. Stay in touch with your friends and your own interests. Sometimes just step outside and get some fresh air. And if you can, exercise, even if it's 5 minutes of stretching or yoga. Do something. But most importantly, don't neglect your own appointments, your medical appointments. I have seen time and time again, caretakers, their teeth have just gone, and so you need to make sure you keep your own appointments. And also maybe this is crazy, try to find some humor. Humor's awesome. I have this delightful couple in Wisconsin, and anytime a new symptom of Huntington's comes into the picture, they say, "Who let George in?" "George Huntington." "Who let him in today?" I did not let him in. So you have to kind of make light of it, and laughter's good. Also, you as caregivers need to vent. And I don't care if it's with a therapist or a friend or a clergy member, you need to vent. You need that support. And I always tell people in my state, if you just are having a bad day, call me. I'm pretty much retired, and I'm around, I'm flexible. And I don't care if it's 5 minutes or an hour, just vent, call me. We also have the Amwell telehealth program that HDSA sponsors, and I know it's not available in every state, but if it is in yours, it can be really, really beneficial. I think you get 8 free counseling sessions per family member, but you need to vent. And then we get into the later stage of HD. And this is where your loved one becomes dependent on you for almost everything. You might find increased chorea or the complete opposite, just rigidity. Your loved one might stop communicating completely and just look at you with a blank stare, or they might start screaming. They can't ambulate safely. They need 24-hour care and supervision. This is where I get the phone calls from people saying, "Debbie, I can't do it anymore. It's affecting my health." A year ago, I had a lady who was able to keep her husband home for years. And she called me last summer and she said he's gotten into the phase where he gets up every night, every hour on the hour, it seems, and he gets out of bed and he falls. He's a big man. So then she would put him into bed and she'd fall back asleep, but within an hour, same thing. And she said, "I'm operating on 2 hours of sleep a night. I can't keep doing this." I had another gentleman say he tore his rotator cuff trying to get his wife out of bed. This may also be the time when your doctor may recommend increased home care services, bring in some medical equipment. He might order hospice services, or he might use the god-awful word placement. Now, I cannot imagine a more difficult or painful decision for any person or family to have to make. That's a tough one. You talk about guilt. That's guilt off the charts. But if it happens, I tell people, first of all, reach out to your HDSA social worker. I know in Wisconsin, I keep a running list on our Wisconsin website of all the different facilities, group homes, assisted living, nursing homes, that accept HD patients or have had experience with them. Call your ADRC. They can sometimes help with placement finding. Tour some facilities, shop around, put your name on a wait list. I even tell people, because I tend to be a little paranoid, on each of our states has a Department of Health website, and you can actually look up a history of violations for every single care facility in your state. Now, most of the violations are like the exit light is out, big deal. But you can kind of screen what's a good home, what's a good place. It's not a bad idea. And then once your loved one is placed, I always say, call your social worker and ask them to come in and do an in-service for the nursing home staff. That's one of my favorite jobs. I love going into facilities and training staff because most people will say, we've never heard of it. We don't know what to do. What do we do? But I think you need to know at this stage that making that decision can at times be the greatest gift you can give your loved one. Because knowing that they are in a safe place, receiving professional care and treatment, can actually free you up to engage in other parts of the relationship that you may have been neglecting. I know one of our support group leaders in Wisconsin shared with me that her husband was in a nursing home before he passed, and she said that was the most horrible decision she had to make. But when she would go visit with him, she said we would just hold hands, and we would watch TV, we'd watch movies, we'd look through old pictures, listen to music, and they could just be together. But the most important thing I think here to understand is that everybody has a limit to what they can handle. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person or that you've failed or that you don't love your loved one. It just means you're human. And I have always said we are here to share our lives with our loved ones, but not to sacrifice our lives for them. That's it. Thank you. I have handouts. If anybody wants one. Are there any questions of me? No? Oh, yes.
On the humorous side, I was inquiring about a study for treatment in California, and I was talking to the doctor, and this goes back to when people were in elementary school. They pulled down the map of the United States, and they would say, where are you from, or where the states were located. And most people here know that Alaska and Hawaii are located next to Mexico. And he said, the individual said, well, you can drive from Alaska to Dana Point, California in 8 hours. You'll be here, no problem. I said, okay, I'll think about that one. I'm from Alaska, so.
Yeah. Oh, my God. I know. You have to.
If you cry, it makes it worse.
That's right. You either laugh or you cry. And I had a couple who joined our support group when they were in their mid-70s and shared that their daughter, who was in her late 40s, was diagnosed with Huntington's. And neither one of the parents had Huntington's. And so the father said, was there something going on with the mailman? I mean, what's going on here? But anyway, to make a long story short, he eventually got tested and he was positive. But even in the mid-70s, he was asymptomatic, not a symptom. So Harvard heard about his brain, and they want it, when he's gone, because he's such an anomaly. Well, a couple summers ago, he called and he said that he thought he was having a heart attack. And his wife was out shopping, and he panicked and called 911, and on the way, he called his wife and said, call Harvard, this is it. So they get him to the hospital and they assess him. Well, he was having a panic attack. So anyway, they took him up to a room to calm him down, and we all in the group teased him. Was there ever a knock on the door with somebody holding a styrofoam container? So you do. You have to laugh and try to find some jollies and things. Any other questions? Yes?
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
In regards to us being advocates for our loved ones.
Yes.
And not be intimidated by
Mhm.
the medical profession at times.
Absolutely.
And piggybacking on that, I had an experience where I felt it was behooving the physician to take the role to tell my wife, you know, she might need to not drive anymore. And he retorted back to me and said, "Will you ride with her? You should be able to tell her." And I said,
Oh, no.
"Are you married?"
Exactly.
And he
Exactly.
said, there is a way, because oftentimes a person who's had a stroke, they refer them. And finally, I did have
A driving assessment.
evaluated
Yeah.
objectively.
Yes.
Not on my
I know.
shoulders.
I know.
But I thought I had to be an advocate for
Right.
myself.
Right.
With that position.
Right. Oh, very good.
Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing, that the DMV has a safety office. It's not
Yes.
at every DMV,
Mhm.
but at certain DMVs, and it really helps as a spouse to have a objective
Assessment on-
resource assessment, and they
Yeah.
also have occupational therapists.
Yes.
He wasn't ready to give it up, and so we went and
Yes.
gave money for training and those. And through that process, it helped him accept that it was time.
Yes.
And that's.
Mhm.
Way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, not only that, when she did have that evaluation, I was able to be comforting to her when
Mhm.
she got the diagnosis.
Right.
When told that, she said, "Well, what happens in the case of an emergency?" I said, "Call 911."
Don't drive. Yes.
I'd like to back you up on Lisa Genova's novel, Inside the O'Briens.
Yeah.
My wife and I own a copy, and we've recommended it to friends so they
Yes.
can understand it, because it's very well written, it's a very easy read, and we've seen it transform our friends' understanding.
Yes.
Because you can explain the mechanics of it, but that book
Right.
has opened their eyes, and I can see now they get it.
And that author wrote the book Still Alice. I don't know if you remember, there was a movie about that, and she wrote about Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's. And I read that one, and so this one too is very good. And I had heard a long time ago that they were possibly making this one into a movie with Russell Crowe and I can't remember else, but I haven't heard anymore, so maybe they dropped it. But it's a good book. Yes.
You mentioned one of the earlier symptoms can be not wanting to admit or even maybe not recognizing.
Wow, yes.
And then I think that's even harder when your early symptoms are more cognitive or
Yes.
psychotic rather than
Right.
movement and so I don't know. And let's assume this person also doesn't have a great relationship with the physician and isn't under that care. So if you have any advice, how do you approach that?
I guess the only thing you could do is maybe try to contact the doctor and let the doctor know what's going on, and see if there's any input there. Yeah. Yes.
And just, our son was tested while he was in the Marines, and he got the result. Normally, they bring him in and do a personal statement.
Yeah.
The funny one for him was, he was told over the phone that he's positive, and we asked the neurologist why he did that. Number one, well, he's a Marine, he's 19 years old, he can handle it over the phone. Okay. That's when my wife squeezed my hand so hard that if she squeezed a little bit more, she would have probably asked him questions, he kept quiet. He goes, well, does drinking affect this disease? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't even affect it. That's when she really squeezed it again, and that's when she almost broke it. But yeah, it's, so you gotta take that information that the doctor gives you sometimes with a grain of salt. And,
Yeah. I'm amazed. Yes?
Yeah, just to reinforce what you say about taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
One thing, my dad took care of my mom for more than a dozen years because of a longer disease track. And he was advised to take some time for himself. So he and mom looked at the various nursing places, and she chose the one she would like to. And on occasion, he would check her in for 2 weeks, and he would leave town to go golf in a variety of places, come back refreshed, take her back home, and then they would be good for several months, and then she would go back in. And then eventually, when her health got so bad, she transitioned to the place she had already chosen, was already familiar with, and then my dad had to schedule time to meet with her because she was so busy doing her own things in this new place that she didn't have time for him. And so it made that transition easier. And my dad came to move in with us about 6 months ago. So 2 weeks ago, I said, remember what you did with mom? We're going to do that now this summer. This find a place that should you need a place to go to, you've already chosen it. That way, they're part of the decision. It's not something they're forced to do. It's something they participate in doing. And it made it easier to go through.
Wow. Any other questions? Comments? Be good. Okay, thank you so much.